Hello, everyone. We are live for days 8, 9, and 10 of 40 Days to Purpose. So we're doing these 3 days together because it's all about the plagues. So I figured instead of sort of breaking down each one, it would make more sense for us to just kind of be able to go through all of them except the last plague. So we're going to go through the first several plagues, and then we will jump right in. So it's actually the first, I think on 7 we read the first plague, and then we get 8 more. No, 9 more. I think we get 9 more. Um no, 8 more. And then we get the last one, which is in chapter 11. Okay. So before we get into it, I just want to remind you all to please secure your ticket for the Rise and Shine Summit. This is going to be a very impactful event. And I know that if you are wanting to know, like, what have you been created for? What is God's purpose for your life? Where is He calling you? And what are the things that are getting in the way and how to move past that? You are going to want to be at this event as all these experts come together to speak to you and to give a word as to what God is saying in this season. And I know it's going to be a really great opportunity for networking as well. So you want to make sure to secure your ticket, okay? We also have a book that's launching on May 15th. As of right now, I believe we're still on for May 15th, but it's God Belongs in Business. So if you are an entrepreneur and you want to know how to apply kingdom principles in your business, you're going to want to be a part of that. And yeah, so we're going to just go ahead and jump right into this. So today we're talking about chapters 8, 9, and 10. And I don't think today's going to be as long of a video because I'm not going to actually read a lot of this. Hopefully you guys have been keeping up and you've been able to read through it. But if you haven't, that's also okay. We understand. But you want to get the most out of it. It's really a good idea to try to stay in step with us, and so that way you're not falling behind and you can read along. So I know that God is going to have something for you today. All right, so I just want to make sure, let me just make sure that everybody that wants to be here is able to watch this live. I know we haven't been going exactly at the same time. It's been mostly between 11 or 12 that we've been able to do this. But we're gonna jump right in. Okay. All right. So we're looking at 8, 9, and 10. So if we start off in chapter 8, this is when we start to see a much more confident Moses, right? So at this point, we've already seen Moses approach the Pharaoh more than once, but he was still dealing with a lot of doubts and a lot of other things that were going on. Once he started to see God coming through, I think it built a confidence in Moses as a leader, right? So one of the things that we're going to be talking about at the summit is leadership. It's really, especially for those who feel a call to leadership, I know that it's going to be impactful because we're talking about what does it mean to be a biblical leader? And so we're looking at Moses as a leader, and we're looking at um, how God used him and the process that he went through. So with a lot of this, especially in 8, we're seeing that it says, the Lord spoke to Moses, says to Aaron, stretch forth thy hand and thy rod over the streams, over the rivers, over the ponds. And this is when the frogs came up. We start off in 8 with the frogs. Okay. Now, this is also where you say the magicians did their enchantments and they brought up frogs upon the land of Egypt. So there comes a certain point in these where it can no longer be replicated by the magicians. And what's interesting about this is I think a lot of this is also a little bit of a test, not just for, revealing what's already in Pharaoh's heart, because there's several times where Pharaoh says, okay, like I'll let your people go, fine, and then changes his mind as he hardened his heart. But a lot of that has to do with not a true belief, right? We know the Pharaoh didn't truly believe that God was who he said he was, because then once we see these magicians that do their version, right? They copy, they do a replicate. We know that the enemy replicates, he tries to copy. Once they see that, his confidence is back in his magicians and back in his self. And so, again, I think a lot of this is also testing Moses in this moment, right? Because we have a kind of fearful, doubtful Moses in the beginning, but his confidence as a leader is starting to be really developed and shaped through these chapters. So that's also really important. So anyway, so we see the frogs, and then from the frogs, I think the next one is lice. So he approaches Pharaoh again. Remember, there's like 9 different times that he's approaching the Pharaoh. So think about, even in our lives, if God's called us to do something, usually he does says more than once. It's more than once. So you have to have that persistence to keep going, to keep pursuing, what it is that God gave you as the vision or the thing that he said was going to come to pass. You have to keep pursuing it, because over time, right? If you continue to pursue it and you don't give up, you're going to see the result if that's what God said. There's sometimes we can pursue things and it's not what God wants us to do. And so he may close those doors. But there's times where God wants us to pursue something. He already laid the vision in our heart, and you're moving in the direction and the progress of the thing that God has called you to do. And so the next was lice. And then we see the same thing. The magicians did so with their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they could not. So there were lice upon man and upon beast. So I think this might be I think this might be the first time that the magicians tried and they could not. Yeah, because they were able to bring up frogs upon the land, but this is the first one with the lice that they were not able to actually replicate what God was doing. So now we start to see the heat is going to get really turned up in this story. Now, one of the things that I love. Is that you see God's hand of protection over the people. This story is well known for, when the spirit of death comes and takes the firstborn, which we're going to read in the next chapter. But the story is well known for that. But we miss something important, which is even in the midst of these plagues, nothing touches God's people. Okay, so even in the midst of these plagues, nothing's touching God's people. And we're talking about people who have been praying, people who have been doubting. They did not believe Moses and Aaron. When they heard, it says actually because of the bitterness, because of the things in their heart, they actually turned off their ears to listening to God's sent ones, right? To his leaders in this case, which is Moses and Aaron. So you see that the people still were in a place of unbelief. So, a lot of times when I debate with atheists, they'll say, well, look at all this stuff, God's causing all these things. But you have to understand a lot of it was speaking to the people's hearts, because that generation hadn't known the power and presence of God. The Egyptians hadn't known the power of God. So a lot of what you see here is God making himself known, also having eternity in mind. A lot of us think only temporarily of the things that are happening now, but God has eternity in mind. And his thing is, hey, if you're going to proclaim me as God, right, you're going to know my salvation, you're going to know me. And so I think, it's very interesting when reading the text and understanding it in that way. But we have this thing here with the lice, and then we actually see that they were not able to replicate it. And it says, though, I will put a division between my people and thy people. Tomorrow shall this sign be. And this is where the people were in the land of Goshen. So there's times where God is going to call you into the land of Goshen. He's going to call you into a place of being protected in the midst of chaos. A lot of times we see things happening, and our initial response might be, I need to exit this, right? There's things that are happening right now in college campuses, right? What are these things happening? And our initial response might be self-preservation and protection. But for some of you, is God calling you into that? Is God calling you to be a voice of reason, to be a light, but also to know that you are protected in it? As believers, we're not to run away from difficult things. We're to obviously, with wisdom and with God's okay, to go forward and to be a light in the midst of these situations. If not us, then who will? Right? So who's going to bring the truth in these moments? And so, but I love that it says, in the land of Goshen where my people dwelled, no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end thou may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. So God is saying, not only am I God, but I'm a present God. You have to understand that the belief system, especially the Egyptians or anybody or a lot of people who believe in like a polytheistic worldview, where you have many gods, is that the gods are impartial. Like, they don't really care. Some of them mess with humans. They're not involved. They don't really care about the humans so much. They take on more human qualities than they do quote unquote godlike qualities. And so God is dealing with that, is dealing with that belief system. There's a belief system that exists now, and it's called not theism, not dualism, not dualism. It just escaped me. Deism. Here we go. Deism. And in deism, it's like they believe in a God, but they don't believe in the God that we believe in, because they might say we believe in God, but really they believe in a God that doesn't get involved with our affairs. And that's not true. God is involved. And what we're seeing here is God is saying, I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. Like, I'm involved. I am active. I have my hand in what's happening here, whether you believe that or not. But I'm going to show you through these things that I am present and that I am here. And we see so much of that. And so that we see that again, Moses went out to Pharaoh and entreated the Lord. So each time he's kind of going back and forth, and we see that things are just getting more intense and increased. So you start to see that throughout the rest of the of chapters 8, 9, and 10. So the next one is wild animals or flies. Then you have pestilence of livestock, then boils in chapter 9, and then thunder, storm of hail and fire, then locusts in chapter 10, and then 3 days of darkness, which is so interesting. So I know a lot of people have been talking about the 3 days of darkness prior to, what people are reading in the book of Matthew. I think it's Matthew 24. So you're seeing some of these parallels between the Old and the New Testament. But one of the things that I think is really fascinating, when you get to the ninth plague, which is darkness, I'm going to come back to the other plagues in a moment, but when you get to the ninth plague, I think that this is very fascinating. It says, the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven. Now, do you notice each time these plagues come, there's Moses who's stretching out his hand. We see this later when they're battling. When his hands were lifted, they would win. There's something about lifting the hand. There's something about, when the power of God flows through you, right? So there's a very real and active thing where there's that kind of, I don't know if you want to call it prophetic act or whatever, but Moses had to physically do something, and then God's power was revealed, right? So in this case, that's what we see happening. Moses had to physically stretch out his hand, and when he did so, something happened. Or he had to stretch out his rod, and something happened. So it's not just like Moses was like, I'm just going to talk to it and command it, and that actually is later on with the rock. But anyway, getting ahead of myself. But you see, Moses had to do something. So, what is it that God has already put in your hand? God is calling you to do. What is it that you need to do physically to allow God to use you, right, as that vessel for his power to flow? So, this says, stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt. And this is darkness which may even be felt. Now, I like listening to near death experiences, I find them fascinating. And there's people who have, made claims that, someone's like, I've been to hell or whatever. Some people believe them, some don't. No matter which way you feel about it, it's still interesting when some of them describe a darkness. Like they say, like, hey, I had this experience, I went to hell, and this is what I saw. And it was a darkness that could be felt. You could feel the darkness, like it had a feeling to it. And that's the darkness that they felt here. Now, I don't think this is equivalent to, like, let's say just like an eclipse or something like that. This is a darkness that you could feel. Have you ever walked into a room and it was so, like, there was no light, there's nothing, like you could feel the heaviness, feel the darkness? And that is what this plague was. This was a supernatural occurrence, like something, I believe, more than just blocking the sun, because you have to remember, God is light, right? It says in the book of Revelation that when all these things come to pass, and there's a new Jerusalem, new heaven, new earth, that we won't have need for night and day, because we are in his midst, and he is light, right? So hell is a place where no light exists. God's light is not present there, right? It's ultimate separation from God. Okay. And that's something that can be felt, that level of heavy, of darkness. And it says it was a darkness which may even be felt. So you can imagine, it says, and I kind of find this next part a little funny, but maybe it shouldn't be funny, but I think it's a little funny, because it says, Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. So imagine, it's so dark, you can't see, and you physically can't even move. It said nobody rose from their place for 3 days. Like, they stayed in the same place for 3 days because it was that dark. Like, they had no idea what was going on. Now imagine the state of the soul prior to coming into Christ. Like, I think that's a beautiful image of that. Like, that's where we are, right? Before the light of Christ comes into our life, we may not realize it, but that's the state of darkness that our soul is in. I mean, it's in a place of like, you can't even progress forward. You can't do anything, right? Because without God, God is light, right? He's the true light. We know that there's a false light, but he's the true light. And so what I love about this next part is, despite what was happening to the Egyptians, in verse 23, it says, they did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. So I think these details are so missed when we read these stories, because we have the Veggie Tale versions and all these things that kind of stick with us culturally. But if you look back and look, God protected his people the whole time. First, before these plagues even started picking up, he moved his people to a place of safety, which was the land of Goshen. And he said nothing touched them in Goshen. And when all these plagues happened, they were aware. The people of Israel were seeing these things. They were seeing the plagues of what was happening, but the plague never touched them. And you have to understand that we live in a world where things are going to happen. People are going to go through things, right? We're going to see chaos. We're going to see where everyone's talking about the economy crashing and all these other things, but the Bible says it's not going to touch God's people. God's people are protected. The light was still in their dwelling, and I love that detail. And guys, if you have your Bible open, take verse 23 and highlight that. Okay, that's chapter 10, verse 23. I think that's a beautiful reminder that we have light in our dwelling. There's light that's within us. God says we are the temple, our bodies. So there's light that's within us. So no matter where we go, we can go into the midst of chaos and still be light. And that's what it means to be the light. It doesn't mean to reflect the world. It doesn't mean to mimic or copy darkness and what darkness is doing. I see a lot of confusion of that. It just means that we can be the light no matter where we go, because the light is always dwelling in us, even in the midst of darkness, right? That the world is in, or in chaos. So and then we see this again, and it says, go serve the Lord. Only let your flocks and your herds be kept back. Let your little ones also go with you. So we see that it seems like, okay, Pharaoh's saying, let's go. And then, but Moses said, you must also give us sacrifices and burnt offerings that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. So it's like, okay, we can go, but you also need to provide this for us so we can truly serve him. And it says, our livestock shall go with us, not a hoof shall be left behind. Like, God doesn't forget any of these details. For we must take some of them to serve the Lord our God, and even we do not know with what we must serve the Lord until we arrive there. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. And Pharaoh said to him, get away from me, take heed to yourself, and see my face no more, for in that day you see my face, you shall die. That is crazy, right? Because he says, in that face you shall die. But Moses said, you've spoken well, I will never see your face again. But it wasn't going to be Moses who's going to be the one who would see his fate. It would be Pharaoh, right? It would be the enemies of God's people, who would pursue God's people despite all of God's wonders. Now, I think that this is a really interesting thing, and that a lot of atheists will point to this as well and say, well, we're going to get into, the firstborn and all of that, but you have to understand that it's the fullness of the impact, is the fullness of judgment when it came to what was returned. Because when we started this story, when Moses was born, remember what happened? What happened? There was blood on that land. Right? So there was a decree that went out to kill the firstborn of the Israelites. So this is a return, a fullness. And what's interesting is that by the time we get to 9, if number 9 is actually used scripturally, you'll see a connection with the establishing of man or woman who is complete in the grace of God, in the fullness of the power of God. So as much as this was to show the Egyptians God's power, as much as this was to show the Israelites, it was also to show Moses God's power. And we see a much more confident Moses. Can you imagine him turning around saying, you've spoken well, you will not see my face again? And to know the fullness of what was about to happen. In that moment, this wasn't the same Moses that was questioning, that was doubting. There comes a work in leadership as character work that has to be done in our progression, that God is going to work with us, that we get to this place of confidence in the power of God. Okay, so I thought that that was really interesting with being that that was the ninth plague, and then it was almost the fullness of that character work. So, as much as Pharaoh was for that, Pharaoh was also for the development of Moses because Moses was just starting his leadership journey, right? He was just starting. He would now have to wander for 40 years with the Israelites in the desert. I mean, his process just started. His process happened, right? Then it's the testing. It's how many times am I going to put you in front of Pharaoh? Are you going to trust me that I'm going to come through? So a lot of this was also testing and establishing Moses as that leader in the fullness of the character work that had been done. Okay, so I thought that that was really interesting with the number nine. Now, the last thing that I want to share before I wrap up here is an interesting thing about each of the plagues. So, because we're going to wrap up the plagues and then tomorrow we're going to get into the final plague. But when you look at the plague, some people are like, well, why did God choose lice? Why did he choose boils? Like, why did he choose these things? And this was a direct attack on the false gods, on the Egyptian gods. And if you want to understand this for yourself for today, right? If God's speaking to you through this, there are gods that we might have, whether realizing it or not, right? Money for people can be a god. Your marriage for some, like your spouse, can become a god. There are things in our lives that can become gods to us. And so part of that work is God has to heal that in us. So we only look to him as those things, as our provider, as our support, as our love, as the first of our everything. So just I want you to try to see if you can see the parallels here between looking at the Egyptian gods and the God and how there are gods that we can have today that may not be as present in our thinking, but that they can become gods. Anything that is replacing God in our lives. Okay, so what were the different plagues? We're going to go through this really quickly, and I'm going to connect them to each of them. But we see that this represents a fullness, right? This number 10, complete, full, a full completion. And the first one that we saw was with the Nile River. Now there's an Egyptian god. It was Happy, Hapi, Happy. He was the Egyptian god of the Nile, and he was a water bearer. Okay, so this was the belief system of the Egyptians, and so turning the water into blood, that was a first example. That was a direct attack on Hapi. And that happened for 7 days, right, throughout all of Egypt. So they were in this state where they had no suitable drinking water. They couldn't bathe. They couldn't do anything. And so this was to demonstrate that the Lord was superior to all of those other gods of Egypt, including this specific God. So this was a direct attack on this God. Then you have Heket. Now, Heket was the Egyptian goddess of fertility, water, and renewal. And she had the head of a frog. So why did frogs come up? To show that there was power, that Heket didn't have power over the Nile, over the frogs, that the frogs came up on the land, and the only way that they receded was through God, right? Through God giving and Moses giving that command. So it said Pharaoh refused to let the children go, but we see that the frogs came up from the river and they were everywhere. So this goddess Heket, powerless, right? Powerless over the one true God. And then you have Geb. Geb was the Egyptian god of the earth. So lice, when the lice came up, they came up from the dust of the earth. Now, Pharaoh still would not concede at this point, okay? But you see, after this display of power, he still wouldn't let them go. But the lice coming up from the earth was direct attack on Geb, who they believed had power over the dust, over the earth, okay? So the next one you have was Khepri, and Khepri was the Egyptian god of creation, movement of the sun, and rebirth. And so when you see the swarm of flies, this is the fourth plague, you see what happened here is that there is a miracle. It says the separation or differentiation is when we see this happen. So this is where you start to see the difference, right? Between, and this is so profound. You see the difference between the children of Israel who were protected during this time, the land of Goshen, and those who were not. Now, again, in a direct attack on Khepri, but who was known for what? Creation and rebirth. Now, as believers, we believe that we have a rebirth, essentially, right? We are born again in Christ. The old you is dead, the new you. So this is saying that there's only going to be one rebirth, and it's going to be done through the blood and the sacrifice of Jesus, the acceptance of that sacrifice to then become born again, a new creature, a new creation. So this swarm of flies was an attack against Kepri, who is not responsible for any creation and is not responsible for rebirth. There's one God who is responsible for that. And you'll see the fullness of that when we read and we look at these two things, when we look at the New Testament. Okay. Then you have Hathor. Hathor was an Egyptian goddess of love and protection. Now, Hathor, the Egyptian plague, this was with the death of cattle and livestock. So again, it's she was depicted with the head of a cow. So again, so why livestock? Well, this is against Hathor. She was this one who had a cow head, right? So she's in charge of that. This is direct attack at Hathor. So it says, tomorrow the hand of the Lord would be felt upon the cattle and livestock of only the Egyptians. So it wasn't on the Israelites, it was only on the Egyptians. And it said still, now this would be a direct impact on the economy, right? Because we know that livestock were a big thing with trade. So with the economy, this would be a disaster, right? So you wouldn't have food, transportation, military supplies, farming. All of these things would be impacted through this direct attack on this god. But still, it says that the Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. Then you have Isis. Isis was the Egyptian goddess of medicine and peace. And so in this case, we saw that the ashes were turned to boils and sores. Well, why couldn't Isis, with her medicine, right? Why couldn't she come and heal those boils? Because God has power over creation. Isis is of no effect. And this is the same thing. So cleanliness was really important in Egyptian society, and this plague would pronounce the people as unclean, right? To have these boils. And so even though throughout you would see the magicians performing these things, these ceremonial rituals to their gods and goddesses, they couldn't do that in this state of uncleanliness. And so this was an even greater attack, right? To stand before Pharaoh, they would be seen as unclean. So it's great to be able to see that again, the support of the one true God, which is the God we serve. Now you have Net, which is the goddess of the sky. Now, when the hail rained down in the form of fire, and you see that happen, this was a direct attack against Net, who again, we ask, why couldn't this God stop? Right? Stop the hail, stop these things. So it was to show that the hail had the ability to destroy, and it would rain down from the sky, you would see that it would turn to fire as it hit the ground. So it was intense. It wasn't like just like a little thing with some golf balls. Like, this was intense. And if you take actually the plagues here in the story, there's a lot of parallels to the book of Revelation. I highly recommend you pray into that, just as like an added thing in going along with this study that we're doing. But interestingly, what you'll see is that the crops that were destroyed by the hail were flax and barley. And at that moment is when you would see that they were actually supposed to be ripening in the fields. And so those particular crops were not necessarily what Egyptians focused on mostly for their diets, but it would be more specific for their clothing and for their libations, which is interesting. So mostly for their clothing. And so that would mean that their life would become uncomfortable, right? Because it would affect not just their food supply, because they would need the wheat and things like that, but also their ability to trade and clothe themselves and all of that. So again, this would be another opportunity to say, hey, listen, this God is powerless. I am the one true God. Come and serve me. And so even yet, we see how many of these have we gone through, and people still were not wanting to serve God. There was still not repentance. Then you have Seth. Seth is the Egyptian god of storms and disasters. Now, when the this was with the plague with the locusts. Now, what's very interesting, if you do research in this stuff, you will find that there's a lot, like there's a ton of information about Seth, and there's actually a whole sect of people today that claim to serve this false god, right? That they actually believe that there's a lot of hidden knowledge, and a lot of occult will actually follow his teaching today. Like some things that they believe, that they call themselves followers of Seth, and they're active right now in 2024. Like these people exist. Just because you don't hear about them all the time doesn't mean they're not out there. So there are people that actually believe that, which is really interesting. But he was, again, the god of storms and of disasters. And this was the eighth plague. Okay. Now, for this one, what you see is that the Pharaoh would tell his sons and his sons' sons the mighty things of the Lord. So by this point, we're reaffirming the generational impact. It wasn't just for one thing. It was God was saying, I want this to be so impactful that for generations, people understand that I'm the one true God. I'm not just doing this as a display of power because I want you to understand one thing. No, just for one generation, for it to die out. I want this to have a generational change, a generational impact. And that is very explicitly stated when it comes to this plague. But you see that Moses and Aaron approached Pharaoh with the same request and then pronounced the judgment of locusts if he didn't comply, which he didn't. And the second wave of destruction to follow would follow the hail, and whatever crops were left were now completely consumed, right, by the locust. Like it was done. Like there was nothing left, nothing at all. And a lot of people will say, like, well, why did this happen? And you're seeing actually God's grace, because at this point, we see that as the plagues go on, there's more and more destruction, but there's always opportunity, right? Each time we read about a plague, there's an opportunity to change, an opportunity to turn and to go the other way. And God is gracious. God has extended his grace and his mercy, and we see that here. But by hitting the food supply, it would show that what would be next. If you can't drink water, if you can't eat now, if you can't trade, that society is bound to be destroyed. Okay, so this is showing that all the things that the Egyptians had, they even had because God allowed them to have it. Like that's what they didn't get, and that's what God is pointing to. They had everything they had because of God, because he allowed them to have it. It says that he causes the rain on the just and the unjust. It's not just for the children, but in this case, right, the opportunity to repent presented itself so many times, and still there was a no. There was a firm no. And then you have we have two more gods. I'm not going to do the last one today because I want to save that for tomorrow. But the last one of the darkness had to do with Ra. Now, Ra is the sun god. Now, if you watch some of these, things with like Hollywood and stuff, you have to understand they are very well aware of these Egyptian gods and goddesses. And you actually, if you watch like the Grammys and you watch different things, the Met Gala, the way that they dress a lot of times honors these gods. And I could do a whole thing. I'm actually wanting to write a book. Hopefully that's another project that I have coming up that I'll be working on. But a lot of these gods that you see in different societies, they start with the Egyptian. The Egyptians are kind of like that core anchor. It's one of the ones you learn about early on in school. You learn a lot about them, but they sort of, it's the same being, let's say, the same god that they're honoring essentially, but it changes based on culture. So in the Greco-Roman Empire, you're going to see very similar things that you would see with the Egyptians. They just have a different name and maybe a different mythology or backstory that's connected with them, but a lot of similarities. And a lot of this had to do with the spread of culture, but also because it's the enemy doesn't do new things. He just changes, right? He just changes as he goes. And so that's a whole other thing. But anyway, Ra, the sun god, was very similar to, what a lot of people will try to connect, and they'll say, well, Jesus was just the sun god. Like, this is what Jesus was. Like, this is what people will point to. And you have to understand that God's plan for salvation of humanity started in the beginning of the earth. Like, it started early, right? It didn't just happen afterwards. It's not, this didn't affect God's plan. God's plan was God's plan, and the enemy is the one who puts up the counterfeits. So Ra, the sun god, this was the Egyptian plague, the 3 days of complete darkness. So the one that we read about a lot today. This is directly an attack on Ra. Now, one thing you have to understand is that with this god, the pharaohs often believed that they would be sort of a reincarnation of this god. This god was number one for when it came to leadership, right? So this was a direct attack to Pharaoh to be like, listen, Pharaoh, you're man. You're not a god. And so by attacking with the 3 days of darkness, this was showing that the leaders that were there were humans. That's all that they were. They were man, and they had no power the way that God had power. So that darkness that fell in Egypt, it said a lot of this was to show the future fate to be felt by the Egyptian empire, right? That they would be destroyed essentially. And then also their eternal fate, right? To sit in that thick darkness that could be felt. And it was the 3 days of palpable darkness that was so intense it could be felt, and it covered the whole land of Egypt. Now the sun, right? The most worshipped god in Egypt, the sun, other than Pharaoh himself, could not give light. And this was to show that who had the light? God's people. The light was in the midst of God's people because God is the light. So the Lord showed that he had control over the sun as a witness that the God of Israel had the ultimate power over life and death, right? And so at this point, the darkness was to represent the death, judgment, and hopelessness. The darkness was a complete absence of light. So we can rejoice knowing that we have the light of Christ, and the light of Christ is in us, right? So that's going to wrap up chapters 8, 9, and 10. Tomorrow, we're going to jump into chapter 11. So make sure that you pre-read it. I want to know how this has been impacting you so far. Go live and network for the kingdom. Let me know, how has God been speaking to you in this season? What is God saying to you through these chapters that we've read so far? And we're going to keep pushing forward as we're transitioning 40 days into the next half of the year and what God has for us. And I'm just going to invite you guys one more time. Like I said, we have that light within us, and it is our responsibility to go into the dark places, to go into the media mountain, to go into the education mountain, the government mountain, the religion mountain, wherever God has called you. For some of you, it might be in family right now. Wherever God has called you, you have a responsibility for your light to shine, the light of Christ that is in you, to bring light into those dark places and bring people out of that darkness. And so the Rise and Shine Summit, this is what God gave us. He said, it is time for my people to rise and shine. Rise up out of your complacency, rise up out of where you've been and what you've been doing, and to step into what God has for you. Step into that mountain of influence and shine, to be the light, to bring God's light into that place. So if you have not signed up, we have virtual and in-person tickets. Guys, I highly recommend you sign up. Come be a part of this. Come connect with us. Come network with us. You're going to hear from these experts that God has placed an incredible word within each of them. And I honestly am just like so amazed at when I look at this flyer, the diversity, because the kingdom of heaven is diverse. We all have different backgrounds. We've all come from different experiences. So you're going to get, because I think a lot of times in churches, we don't get a lot of that. We kind of are used to our Sunday thing and our community and our group. And so this is really, we're not specifically backed by any specific congregation or anything like that. Network for the Kingdom, again, it's a bringing together of people. So our hands aren't tied in that way. Of course, we have the support of our home church and our pastors. They're actually going to be speakers at this event. But what's unique about what we do is that we're not tied to those things, right? We can reach out. We've been connecting with local leaders, and we're having people that are going to be a part of this, because I believe believe when God's people come together and we can push back some of those barriers that we've kind of set up for ourselves, we can actually see a true impact and really bring a change in the world. So if you have not yet signed up, the link is there to sign up. Highly recommend that you do so. And we would definitely look forward to being able to see you at the event. Okay. I will join you again tomorrow and we will go over chapter 11. So God bless you. If you know someone who needs to watch this, go ahead and put at highlight, share this out, tag them in this video so they can also get this teaching. Honestly, the thing about the gods and all of that, that was a revelation from the Lord that I had to, that he really took me on some weeks of study. So I was very excited to present it to you guys today. I know we ran over. I said this was going to be a shorter video, but it wasn't. It's okay. But I hope that it blessed you, and we'll be back